Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for today's AIAA Los Angeles Las Vegas section E meeting, E-Town Hall meeting on November 6, 2021. Today we have very exciting presentation and a very top distinguished lecturer speaker. And this is the beginning of a series of lectures on this amazing topic. So before that, we have few logistics to go over. So first of all, thanks a lot for AIAA headquarters. They provide this very wonderful Zoom platform, actually very expensive. And they highly support us for our events. The recording and the podcast will be posted after the event. Thanks a lot to our speaker, Mr. Paul Szymanski. Just for some short note that during the lecture, if you have any question, you are welcome to type in the Q&A box or wait till the end of presentation and click raise hand. You will be unmuted and you will be able to speak out, directly interact with the speaker. So tentatively, the presentation is like 1 hour, then followed by 30 minutes of Q&A and networking if you stay. So a few words about AIAA. AIAA is a national organization, but also have international presence. Our president is Mr. Bassel Hassan. Our executive director is Mr. Daniel Dumbacher. He was the former program manager for the NASA DCXA. And our section chair is Dr. Jeffrey Puchel. He's an AIAA fellow, the Raytheon chief scientist. Unfortunately, he's busy today, so he asked me to welcome everyone and enjoy the event. So AIAA has over 30,000 members across multiple companies, countries, and companies like SpaceX, Blue Origin. They are our corporate members. Our vision is shaping the future of aerospace. And AIAA is a organized professional organization of very long, distinguished history. It came from a merger in 1960 from two distinguished organizations, both founded in 1920s. One on aviation, founded by the Wright brothers in the 1920s. The other one was the rocketry, founded by Robert Goddard, also in the 1920s. This is our different level of membership. Young professionals should have been called early career professional. They are after college but under 35 years old, but they are still professional. We are running a great discount, 50% off for early career professionals. And we also have educator, high school, college students. So once you join AIAA member, you can immediately use Engage, AIAA Engage to connect to members and experts around the world. Every day you will receive daily launch with great insider stories. Some people got opportunity from those information. And of course, the monthly Aerospace America, very famous, a lot of very good articles and stories. And you will enjoy great discount for attending AIAA national forums. One thing is AIAA also publish, and it's very important feature. And you can connect to industry and also have awards. One thing very important for AIAA is to encourage, inspire people. So you do good jobs, you got awarded, encouraged, and you can advance your ranks in AIAA. For example, our section chair, Dr. Jeffrey Puchel, is fellow. And Mr. Steve Izakowicz from Aerospace Corporation is the president of Aerospace Corporation. He is also a fellow. Dr. James Worth, the president of Microcosm, is also fellow, and many more. And we have honorary fellow like Bill Gerstenmaier and Dr. Mark Lewis, Queen Shotwell, with Buzz Aldrin, Dr. Buzz Aldrin. And we also have awards, like Guggenheim Awards, Reed Awards, many things you got, honor, and this help people to advance their career. So student, if you are still a member, you can apply scholarship, attend the annual regional student paper conference, attending the design, build, and fly contest, rocket contest. And one very important thing is nationally, we have 5 major forums. Next month, we'll have the AIAA Ascent in Las Vegas, but actually the online event start on Monday, November 8th to 10th. Then again, also 15 to 17. But the in-person in Las Vegas is only 15 to 17. You're highly welcome to participate, to attend. So this is the 5 major national forums I mentioned. So a few words about local Southern California. Actually, our speaker today actually very familiar with this area. He worked with SMC, Space and Missile Center, now changed to Space Command. And in addition, we also have many companies. The James Webb Space Telescope is going to be launched on December 18 by Northrop Grumman. It's made by Northrop Grumman, and with NASA JPL, SpaceX, Aerospace Corporation, Boeing, Virgin Galactic, Virgin Orbit, and a very vibrant community of students groups like USC, RPL, Rocket Propulsion Laboratory, or LPL, and many new companies like Launcher Space in Hawthorne, Relativity Space in Long Beach, More 3D, Ampere for electric hybrid aircraft, Lockheed Martin, Honeywell, Raytheon, Aerojet Rocketdyne. That's just amazing area with great heritage. So we routinely have been doing events so people can network. All our events are networking events. And so up to today, on December 4th, we have NASA Chief Scientist, former Director of NASA Planetary Exploration Division, Dr. Jim Green, speak to us. Then we'll also have newsletter opportunities, so welcome to participate. Submit your articles or post your progress or activities. So we also post our video podcast on website. You're welcome to enjoy it. We usually just add the Apple podcast, so much more people can enjoy our events. So for today, our speaker, Mr. Paul Szymanski, is an outer space warfare noted author and speaker. He has a great series of lecture. We'll have him back talk to us more. He's a Space Strategy Center. He's a space control consultant. He's actually also affiliated with other some organizations, but today's talk is only related to his personal view. So we are not emphasizing his other affiliation. He has 47 years of experience in missile space warfare policy, strategy, simulation, surveillance, resilience, threat assessment, long-range strategic planning, and command and control. In addition, he has a comprehensive experience base, having worked with multiple series, Air Force, Army, Navy, Marines, civilian agencies like NASA, DARPA, FEMA, and from the Pentagon, Secretary of the Air Force, to system development like Space and Missile Center, System Centers, SMC, now Space System Commands, technology development like Air Force Research Lab, to operational field tests like China Lake Naval Test Center. This gives him a unique perspective in understanding divergent issues associated with each step of DoD procurement process. These are all very exciting topics. I'm sure you have been waiting for a long time. So let's welcome Mr. Paul Szymanski. So all yours, all yours.
Okay, let me see about sharing the screen. Oh, I guess you have to stop sharing.
Go ahead.
Can you see my screen?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. This is always an issue. I am trying to find the Zoom link. Okay, let's try share screen. Okay, can you see my screen now?
Yes, yes.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for the wonderful introduction. Again, my name is Paul Szymanski, and I appreciate you coming out on a Saturday. To my mind, this is a critical subject, at least recently it's gotten quite a lot of press and so forth. And so I want to just show you some of my ideas that I've come up with personally, actually. I'm retired now, and at the time I had security clearances, but I haven't for 9 years now. They all timed out. So this is all kind of open source interpretation of what's been happening. And you've already seen this about myself. My consulting business, I call the Space Strategy Center. Same acronym as SMC, but essentially I'm trying to put together foundational outer space warfare, the theory of how to fight and win space wars, the doctrine, strategies, and tactics. And I do a lot of study of classical military history and tactics and things like that. And I believe you can apply that to space, that you're really talking about human beings fighting each other's minds, and they transmit intent and will and so forth to each other with military equipment, space equipment, and with soldiers, sailors, guardians, and so forth. But it's still the same concepts that are applied one way or the other. So I like to look at what are classically, again, called space grand strategies, operational strategies, and tactics, and ultimately link these to the ground battlefield, because there really aren't colonies in space. You know, you got the ISS and all that, but really what we're doing in space ultimately impacts what's happening on Earth. And so you have to really try to figure out how you link up with what's happening on Earth. I mean, maybe there's a particular battle plan, a sequence of events, a tempo, and so forth. So you've got to think of how to implement denial strategies against an adversary space assets based on what his capabilities are, what his strategies are, what his intents are, and how that relates to what's happening on the terrestrial battlefield. So I think it's very important to use the same terminology, you know, that Army and Navy types can understand in space, and even to have integrated battlefield situation displays. And I've done some work on that too, so that you can have an Army general come in who knows nothing about space and readily understand, oh yeah, it looks like these satellites that I depend upon are about to be attacked, and we've got to, do something about it. So I need to make what I call normalization, but space battle management has to reflect terrestrial warfighting principles, so you can have it as an integrated whole. So what I want to do here is give you a general introduction to warfare, some of the principles and so forth. And then I'm going to speak about a specific battle that happened in space over the Ukrainian conflict in 2014. And I love this quote from Churchill, World War II. He says, you can take the most gallant sailor, the most intrepid airman, or the most audacious soldier, and you put them together in one room, and what do you get? The sum of their fears. One has to still think in terms of human emotions in space, though in some sense, if you're talking about space wars, it seems like an extension of drone wars, UAS systems and so forth, where you've got operators thousands of miles away, essentially playing video games on the battlefield. only in space, you're not talking about, generally anyone dying or anything like that. So there's a certain video game mentality, which I suppose is very different than a soldier in a trench about to die on the battlefield, and a different psychology. And it'd be interesting to have, if there is such a thing, military psychologists look over how that may be different in the space environment. So getting back to this, what I mentioned already, all warfare is between human minds. And you got to remember that. And so a lot of the principles of classical warfare still apply to futuristic space conflicts. And, this quote here from an ancient Greek historian is that really the principles of war, even though you're out there to break things and kill people, I guess, and so forth, you're really trying to change minds, ultimately. Was it Clausewitz or something? Politics by other means, is what he means is that it's just a more dramatic way of relating to other countries and potential adversaries to make them change their mind in one sense or another. And then this other quote from Akami, that you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. And so you might have a lot of peaceniks going around saying, oh, space wars, that's terrible, but if you, put your head in the sand and ignore it, it's going to bite you sooner or later. So you got to think about it. You got to plan for it. You got to defend, and you probably have to have an offensive arm. Best defense is an offense, and so forth. And one might even think about, well, if the way space has become so important to the United States and to potential future adversaries, you might fight a war in space and find out, well, it's not even worthwhile fighting the war on the ground if we lost in space. I mean, how does a Navy carrier battle group communicate back to CONUS without satellite communications? I mean, are they still practicing troposcatter comm? How do they have their jets establish waypoints to targets? How do they service the targets without GPS accuracy? How do you do bomb damage assessment and all of these things without space? So it's conceivable that in the future, you could have a war in space. No one gets hurt, so to speak. You might lose a couple $2 billion worth of space gear, but no one dies on the ground. And another way of looking at this too is in order to fight a battle in space, and I'm not talking, people talk sort of tactical onesies, like, oh, this RPO, this satellite's coming close to us and poking at us and inspecting and all this. Well, that's kind of a peacetime crisis level form of warfare. That's not really major warfare where you've got 50 targets you're servicing, and there's a very complex sequencing of events and different strategies and different intents and things like that you've got to figure out. And so in order to, there's two ways to attack in space. The space, I say, oh, yeah, it's different psychologically, or it's the same psychologically to terrestrial warfare, but the physics are kind of different. And one is, if you have an anti-satellite, an ASAT, in an orbit, it cannot start maneuvering at any given time in that orbit. There's only specific times that it can start maneuvering to go match the orbital characteristics of a target. In other words, attack it. And so there's certain key choke points in space, jumping off points, and there's two ways of attacking. You can either launch all of your ASATs at the same time, but then they will hit their targets at different times, or you can launch all your ASATs at different times and hit your targets all at once for surprise effect. So if you've got these key choke points, let's say, that you would base your ASATs in, it appears to me, if you have good space situational awareness, space domain awareness, and if you can see an adversary building up at these choke points, with satellites, space systems that appear to be threatening, you might be able to frustrate those attacks, either physically by attacking the attackers before they even launch, or going to the UN and say, hey, looks like they're setting up for this attack in space. And we know that they would attack in space before they would even attack on the ground to take out our eyes and ears. It looks like they're giving strategic indicators that they want to attack on the ground, and maybe you can prevent it. So in some sense, space war might prevent ground war. And so it's something to think about. It's something to develop these different doctrines and diplomatic relationships and things and so forth. But, of course, it's obvious, I'm speaking to the choir here, but space is too important to the United States. The adversaries cannot ignore that. They, really going to do something about it, and actually have been doing things about it. And I'll go over that a little bit. Now, there's very many ways. Space is a system. It's a satellite, it's ground controllers and data reception centers, and then the link between them. And so if you want to deny a satellite, what you're really doing is denying a space system. And you can either go against the satellite, the ground system, or the links. And a satellite is meaningless if it doesn't have ground controllers, to control it or downlink the data, the weather data, the GPS data, imagery, whatever. So if you took out the ground sites, with soft teams or iron bombs, maybe you've kind of done the job. Or if you've got very good jammers, cyber weapons, and he's not able to downlink this information when he's overhead to the stations, maybe you've done that too, and you haven't created any debris in space. So there's many ways. I mean, the latest in thing are inspection satellites, and you'll see a lot in the news about somebody coming up close. And that's because it's very easy in space to hide things, to hide satellites too. And I have a whole briefing on that. But you can have all kinds of war reserve modes inside the satellites, or even extra antennas. No one's going to know unless you get up close and personal and see. And while you're up and close there, well, maybe you can insert some cyber code. Maybe you can have a little pea shooter, that shoot at the satellite. Maybe you can paint the solar panels, or, you can do all kinds of mischief. That's lower levels of conflict that's probably not going to cause a general strategic warfare. So that's the latest in thing, that everyone on the block's got to have their inspector satellite. Trouble that if you're going against LEO or even MEO, low Earth orbit, medium Earth orbit satellites, you only have 5 to 7 minutes of coverage before it passes from being overhead. And artificial intelligence isn't enough nowadays for this, inspection satellite, especially if it has manipulator arms and, it's going to start doing something to your satellite. You have to have a human controller in one way or the other, at 6 degrees of freedom joysticks or whatever. I mean, I've seen these systems. So you need coverage that goes more than 5 or 7 minutes. So you need some sort of relay satellite to be able to provide continuous coverage. Now you can provide continuous coverage at geosynchronous, if it's over where you've got a ground controller station. But I think in many instances, it's the relay satellites that are the most vulnerable. And again, another choke point for information flow for these kinds of things. But I don't really believe in the inspector satellites for general major war in space. And they're more intel collection and looking to see, is there a secret door on this side? Are there other antennas? What's the size and frequency range of the antennas? What are the materials used? What's their vulnerability to laser? All these kinds of things that you can look at. Hopefully you get a copy of this briefing, but you can look at all the various means, threats, and so forth against space systems, not only the satellite, but everything else that's on the ground too. Okay, history of space warfare. believe it or not, it goes back to Roman times. Lucian's True History gave Roman legions attacking the moon, and I guess they had giant spiders or something like that. But it's been in people's imaginations. I mean, even right after Sputnik, famous artists had space planes attacking satellites and so forth. But in the more real world, there's been a lot of different systems that have been developed over the years. I mean, I have a piece of a computer from Johnston Island that was the direct descent nuclear ASAT in the 1960s. You know, we've had these things. It's come out in the last few years on the Russian Almaz satellite. They had an anti-aircraft gun on that. And to shoot down threatening satellites coming towards. I don't really know how that works. I mean, you'd have to, every action gives a, you know, opposite reaction. So the space station would, you know, go backwards after you shot it. And so you'd have to remaneuver it. And the thing is anti-aircraft cannon. Well, it's not like shooting down a plane and all the pieces fall to the ground. You shoot up something coming at you, well, all the pieces are still coming at you, more or less. So I don't know how that would all work. I think there's more subtle and clever ways to take care of threats. But I was on the F-15 anti-satellite program, the ALOSat, air-launched ASAT, with the F-15. I worked at the Pentagon at the time. The program element monitor said, as far as he was concerned, the program was just a negotiating chip with the Russians over their kinetic anti-satellite system, which I don't know if it still exists. I don't know if this thing still exists. You'd think, well, it worked, it tested. Why would you put it away? You know, maybe it's sitting somewhere. I know someone told me on top of a safe here at Air Force Research Labs in Kirtland was one of the miniature homing seekers. So for what that's worth, just sitting there. And then there's been all kinds of anti-satellite concepts since the 80s. Here's some actual Russian concepts of lasers and space fighters. I mean, maybe what's the miniature vehicle that's up there, it goes up for more in a year. Maybe that's kind of a space fighter. You never know. And then I want to emphasize that there's many ways to skin the cat. This is the heavy earth terminals that we took out in Iraq during a Desert Storm to deny the Iraqis the ability maybe to see the left hook with imagery satellites. I mean, I knew the Navy captain who was in charge of Schwarzkopf's intel staff. And he said that Schwarzkopf purposely put the French forces on the leftmost of the left hook so that they'd be the most vulnerable, so that it would inspire them to turn off SPOT, their imagery satellite, commercial imagery satellite system. So the Iraqis wouldn't be able to image all this forces moving into the desert. So I'm not sure how true that is, but that's what he claimed. Okay, there's been various space wars, incidents, whatever kind of level you want to talk about it. I mean, I remember in the 1980s going to the Laurel, Maryland FCC site, which would look at satellite interference. And they told me that in the 1960s, the ComSat, that was the name of the satellite, communication satellite, US satellite, was jammed for several days. And they would move the satellite, roll the satellite, and the most intense signal was coming from off the East Coast. So they figured it was a Russian trawler jamming it for some reason. And you know, the one thing about space is you're not really sure who's who and what the intent is, though you can show resolve and intent without killing people and things like that. But you know, I doubt an ASAT is going to have a big red star painted on the side of it. You're not really sure why some things stop working. Another thing, again, when I was in my 20s, just starting out, I was working with a NASA guy, and he claimed CSAT, the NASA satellite to measure wave height, when they first turned it on, they said, oh my gosh, we can see nuclear submarines cruising at depth, that it gave a slight wiggle to the ocean going for miles, and that they faked its death. I mean, this is the guy at NASA telling me this. And then years later, working with the Satellite Assessment Center and so forth, it was their favorite target to do imaging, compensated optics and things like that. And that satellite's all bent out of shape. It looked like it had been attacked in one way or the other. So that's all I know. These are all kind of suspicious things. I don't have proof one way or the other. The other thing, in the mid 1980s, neither Russia or the US could seem to launch the satellite. Every time a missile was sent up, a launch vehicle, it would crash into the ocean. And it had going on for 6-8 months, and no satellites would get up there. And it just seemed suspicious to me at the time that they were getting attacked, tit for tat or something like that. And again, I don't have the actual proof of that, but statistically that seemed what was going on. There's another incident that I can't talk about under this environment. This one I will talk about using open sources during the Ukrainian crisis. And then, I've been in this business 47 years. Usually there's 2 or 3 job announcements a year for my kind of people over most of those 47 years. But in the last 5 years, there's been an explosion of job announcements, hundreds if not thousands. And I can sense a panic in the US government over space warfare. And if you just look at the establishment of the Space Force, here's the Republicans and Democrats in Congress not able to agree on anything, but suddenly magically, oh yeah, we really agree, we need a Space Force. Something very dramatic happened to inspire the fact that, yeah, we really got to get serious now. And other countries around the world knew what happened. And you can see the establishment of their space commands and so forth, that there was a big thing that happened. And again, that's the beauty of space, that attacks can happen, big things can happen, and you don't have to rile up the population to, and have them force you to do things. Like, the Falklands Island, did Britain really care about it? Or was it, being taken over was too much for their citizens, and they forced something to happen on that? And I don't know how many of you guys work the space warfare thing, but subtlety is everything in space, or in space denial and so forth. Because many times, for example, many countries use different channels on Intelsat, international consortium. And if you want to deny a country, during Desert Storm, Iraq, or whatever, one channel, well, you're not going to send a missile against that satellite and blow it up, and everyone's going to be mad at you. So you need kind of subtlety to what you're doing, and you need various means of attacking. So there's things like, you want temporary effects, maybe partial effects. And so we're talking about different ways of doing things that get up to more and more severe kinds of attack. But also important is non-attribution, like, oh, the satellite just stopped working. I didn't do it. I wasn't there. And, oh, well, it was flying over Antarctica at the time. No one was looking at it. It's very hard to prove anything happened in space. And that's the point of the plausible deniability. This whole point of it, really what's happening there is tens of thousands of kilometers away. It's very difficult to directly image a satellite or constantly image a satellite to see if somebody's coming at you. And, who's that somebody? Let's say, oh, we're at war with China over Taiwan or something like that. And one of our satellites stopped working. And you sit there and you scratch your head, and it's like, well, maybe it was solar flares, maybe meteorite hit it, maybe it's just normal, failures of electronics. Happens on my radios and stuff like that. you're not really sure. And do you want to start a space war when you're not really sure? And you could sit there and say, well, we're having to be a war in the Western Pacific. It's probably the Chinese, but maybe it's the Russians stirring the pot. And so I think there's a certain amount of self-denial that'll go on. And my calculations and simulations have shown real space wars, not onesies and twosies, but taking out multiple targets and all. That'll be over with in 24 to 48 hours before we even figured out what happened to us, or even what was the intent of the adversary. Was it a decapitation attack? They're taking out comms, ISR? Are they just showing resolve? Is it prelude to something worse happening on the ground? How do you figure that out and figure it out in time and then do something about it? Tough problem. So unique characteristics of space systems. It's global. Everything you do there is a global war in one sense or another. I mean, you might deny a satellite over the battlefield. Well, maybe use a laser to blind it or something. But you could just as easily have attacked it 1,000 miles away, a Navy ship sending up a missile over the South Atlantic or something like that. You know, it's just a whole global thing you got to think about. Plus, I've got a cyber technique to be able to deny the information coming down to the ground station, to the adversary in country. But he can just as easily download it to another country, Thailand or something like that, and have it come in via submarine cable. Are you going to deny a Thai ground station? You have special forces go in? No, you're not going to do any of that. You're not going to probably do a cyber attack either. So it's kind of a whole global thing, and you can't just sit there and think tactical all the time. You got to think the bigger picture, and it's highly political. People, unfortunately, kind of used to war and death on the ground. I think the first fully space war that the public learns about is going to have a lot of implications. And, we might lose allies over it, just politically, like, oh, we really don't like war in space, kinds of things. There'd be a lot of demonstrations and all that. And maybe even politicians voted out of office. You don't know. And so it's probably best to keep it under wraps, as best that you can. And that's why I'm mentioning it's, space and space wars, satellites are largely hidden from public view and really hidden from other people's views, other countries, maybe, other parts of the military. Space Force might do something in space and they're not going to tell the Navy about it, purposely. You might really not know what's happening, one way or the other. And then there's many peacetime consequences, treaties that might be signed. If we lose a war in space, maybe we'd lose some of our allies that go over to the other side saying, well, we thought the US was so strong. I guess they weren't, And then the other thing is we talk about NATO helping us in space and it's a new battleground and so forth. Well, if we're again at this conflict in the Western Pacific, it takes a heck of a long time to move satellites. And if you've got satellites that are kind of concentrated over Europe, your allies aren't going to help you. You got to fight with what you got in hand at the time. Really, that's kind of one of the principles. And then this other thing, going back to the physics, I define two space objects to be close to each other in that if it takes a minimal amount of fuel and time to match orbits. So according to that definition, you can have a satellite on the opposite side of the Earth from you, and it still be close if it's the same altitude and inclination. It just takes a little bit of phasing to come at you. So you have to think different of what's considered close. You have to have situation maps that are different. Throw out those maps where you have 10,000 space objects spinning around and it's 3D map and you got a data glove and all that. You got to kind of simplify it to the point where maybe it's like an Army situation map and you can see how certain forces are going closer. You could see, gosh, I see 20 different unknown space objects, half of them I thought were junk, suddenly maneuvering towards key assets. I've got 12 hours to do something about it, you know, that kind of thing. And then I'll go over the rest of these kind of quickly. I'll probably start running out of time soon enough. I have a tendency to spend 2 hours going over the first 10 slides, but at any rate, there's more ways, you know, there's many non-debris causing ways to attack space systems. And at lower levels of conflict, there's certainly diplomatic, economic. Cyber is the end thing. Everyone's into the cyber things that you can do all kinds of, let's say, more subtle things. Though some of these things might cause debris if it causes the satellite to go crazy, I guess. You've got the directed energy that can blind or maybe someday be able to slice satellites in half, high-powered lasers and so forth. And then there's the physical attacks. If you isolate the satellite from the ground, it's worthless. And so if it has no way of communicating to the ground, you've taken out their centers that are receiving the information or processing it, or maybe even denying the ground communication to those. Maybe you've done the job, at least for a while. And then there's the more classic kinetic kill vehicles going against satellite systems. These inspector satellites or maintenance satellites with, you know, manipulator arms. You grab a satellite, pull it out, disassemble it, cut wires. You know, to me, it's like taking a satellite, throwing it in a wheelbarrow and wheeling it into my garage, and then I get to go at it. You know, I'll drill a hole here, cut this wire, saw this, bend that. You know, if you got this manipulator satellite, and if you got human control on that, you can do a lot of things. The trouble is, I don't think inspector satellites, manipulator satellites, and so forth are that timely. It takes days, weeks to maneuver in the right position. And if the space war is over within 24 hours, these things aren't going to help you. These are more lower level conflicts as far as I'm concerned. Now, the other thing is because of the obscurity of space, being able to get away with a lot. And, you know, I estimate there's been about 6 space wars since the 1970s, and probably more. You got away with a lot. And quite frankly, the Ukrainian conflict, you got away with a lot. But it provides additional rungs on a conflict escalation ladder where countries can communicate, you know, resolve an intent. And I'm really serious now. I just blew up your satellite or whatever, without necessarily resorting to a terrestrial conflict where human lives might be involved. Now, of course, you really have to study this. It's like, well, a war in space could cause a war in the ground or vice versa too. So we're not really sure of escalation control, and I've got a whole briefing on that too. But at least it's an additional forum that's actually worked for a few years. And I see space now like the Cold War in the 1960s and 70s, where you had Russian destroyers cutting off our destroyers, and sometimes they accidentally hit and so forth, and U-2s and SR-71s probing air defenses of Russia and all this. And I think the same thing's going on in space, that they're kind of messing with each other. And maybe that's good, you know, it keeps things on tap and so forth. It doesn't get too serious on that. Let them kind of blow off steam, maybe. Now, this is what I mentioned, that, you know, there's a linkage between space and ground, maybe. I mean, I'm not a diplomat and all that, but I think that deserves to be analyzed. And then the other thing is well, it's easy to define winning a terrestrial conflict. You've got, oh, well, we recaptured this territory. We destroyed his tanks and war making industries. We captured the capital. We seized the guy in charge and changed the political system and all that. Well, who's the guy in charge in space? Who's the capital? According to the UN, we can't own territory in space. So how do you define winning? And it's conceivable that both sides can claim they won. Well, yeah, that's typical politics. But, you know, how do you say, okay, these are our objectives before we start the war. Now we've met those objectives. Now we're going to terminate the conflict. So I've got a whole briefing on that, but I've got 50 or 60 principles that might be sufficient for war termination criteria. Oh, and you can just click on these things here and get to some of those briefings. And then I've sort of mentioned this again, and maybe this is to a lot of people on the ground. This is a terrible thing to say, but I think fighting wars in space is better than fighting them on the ground. Fewer casualties, fewer ground structures destroyed. And there's all kinds of subtle things that you don't have to create debris. I have another briefing on that, of all the subtle ways that you can mess with satellite systems, take out their capability without creating debris. Now, the trouble is because space is so obscure, so far, you can't really see what's happening. Do you really know you're under attack? People talk about keep out zones and all. Well, if you look at the orbital dynamics, satellites come close, or space junk or whatever comes close to each other all the time with natural orbital motions. You can't be shooting things down just because they came close if it's peacetime, And so and then if you believe space is very important to ultimately a terrestrial conflict, do you have a use it or lose it mentality? That can you really detect an attack being built up in space and have enough confidence to attack them? Do you have to wait until you absorb the attack? But if it's over within 24 hours, you just lost. Is this concept of a hair trigger, almost like nuclear war of decades past, that whoever shoots first wins? I don't know, kind of thing. So that's something, again, that should be analyzed. I mean, I think we should establish a Space Force kind of think tank, like RAND is for the Army, or no, I'm sorry, there's Project Oriole for the Army and RAND for the Air Force. The Space Force needs its own think tank to kind of discuss these issues. And here are some of the possible war termination criteria. I've got a whole bunch of them, but let me move on. Title of the speech actually was the war in space over the Ukrainian conflict. And here's the timeline of what was happening. I estimate it was 20th February 2014, the war started in earnest. That's the first day that a lot of people got killed. It was a little bit sniping beforehand. And then if you have this briefing, if you click on these links, they'll show you the news articles. So in March, the Ukrainians jam and they claim attempted to decay Russian communication satellite. And I don't know which one they went against, but you're not going to decay it if it's in geosynchronous. But nevertheless, they try to spin it out or something like that. So that was, a space attack on the blue side. And then on the 2nd of April, the entire Russian GLONASS, their GPS system, had a system-wide failure. All 24 satellites stopped working for 13 hours. I'll show you that analysis. And then I guess the Russians didn't exactly get the message, because that was a messaging. I mean, I doubt the rebels in Eastern Ukraine are using GLONASS navigation that much. I mean, they all know where all the roads are and everything's at and all that. It was a messaging. And they didn't get the message. So 2 weeks later, another 8 satellites failed, magically. And there's a few other things, like this Russian ballistic missile early warning system was lost. Now, I'll tell you one thing. National technical means, early warning satellites you should not touch with, because it appears to me that's an indicator, precursor to nuclear war. That's the first thing you want to do before you start initiating nuclear war, is to take out his eyes and ears in space so he can't tell what missiles are coming at him. So if you shouldn't even have an inspector satellite, you shouldn't even get near any of those things, because the other side doesn't know what your intent is. And they might say, hey, it looks like they're setting up for a nuclear attack, so just, don't mess with us. And then on the 30th April, the Russians kind of hit back. And this is what I'm saying. This is kind of a diplomatic thing. at the time, Russia was launching our astronauts to the International Space Station. Shuttle had been retired. And the head of the Roscosmos said, well, you guys, you can start using a trampoline now to get to space. You know, a wise guy threat. And this is all space warfare. You know, there's all this subtle diplomatic, economic, even cyber warfare in sense is a subtle means of space warfare. It's the whole spectrum. And that's what Space Force has to understand. You're not just some lieutenant there at a screen and, oh, I just took out this satellite. Well, why did you take it out? You should be taking out a capability, not necessarily a satellite. What are the implications afterwards? You create space junk. What are the political implications? You know, is the general populace going to find out, or there's going to be protests? I don't know. You know, you got to think that all through. Okay, continuing. This is my favorite. 16th May, a Russian launch vehicle carrying a communication satellite that would cover the eastern Ukraine crashed on a Chinese village during launch while Putin was conducting a diplomatic visit to China, pushing Russian space capabilities. Now, that's circumstantial, but that sure sounds like a signal to me in one form or another. And then there's a bunch of other failed communication satellites. All of these are statistically more than normal at the time. And I mean, I can't prove, you know, that there was an attack one way or the other. There's another interesting thing. While the US was attacking the GLONASS system, and I'll mathematically prove they were, the European Galileo, their GPS system, suddenly had a launch failure, launching on Russian Soyuz rockets out of South America, Alcantara, at any rate. And that sounds like messaging to the Europeans too. But again, I'm not sure one way or the other. And then this is the end of the conflict. And I'll tell you how it works in a second. There was a Russian cyber attack on the American banking system, 28th of August. Look it up. It was in the papers. 5 major banks in New York City had tens of millions of bank accounts, stock accounts and all downloaded. And the banks at the time says, boy, it looks like it's Russian servers coming from. And then a few days later, you never hear anything more about it. I mean, a lot of that happens. You got to read the tea leaves in the press. But the strange thing is a week later, suddenly everyone was at the negotiating table in the Ukraine. Suddenly, okay, well, now we're all going to do a truce. And I'll describe what that all means in a second. So first of all, people in Britain published that during the time they had GLONASS receivers. They had a receiver here in the south of England. That's where they physically were at. But the GLONASS receivers were showing these positions, kind of random positions, I don't know, tens of kilometers away. So there was error induced by cyber weapons. And then the Russians published the date and time when their various satellites here started blinking out. And so I said, well, you know, I'm a rocket scientist. I got my orbital dynamics software. I'm going to try to figure out where were these satellites, these GLONASS Russian satellites, where were they located when they started blinking out, the exact times and so forth. So, you know, every 2 weeks I download the NORAD, well, it's not called NORAD anymore, the Space Force catalog, satellite catalog, you know, anyone can sign up and do that. And so I got the orbital elements and propagated them and found out that every time a Russian GLONASS satellite was over Alice Springs, Australia, it would blink out, you know, strangely. And this is showing you the orbits, Alice Springs, and the white lines are showing you when there was coverage over that particular region of Earth. And this is a flat map view. This is showing you the orbits of, let's say, this Cosmos 2434, the GLONASS 13, when it would cover the eastern Ukraine and how it comes over, and then suddenly it's over Alice Springs and how where its access points are. And this is the actual time of when various satellites would be over Alice Springs, the actual physics of it. And this is looking up from Alice Springs and when what you would see in terms of the orbit of the satellite as it's coming over. And Alice Springs, well, since the 1960s, it's been noted as a NSA listening post. Nothing classified about that. The Australians have at least 2 movies on that I've seen on that. And then the Air Force, now the Space Force, will gladly tell you about their counter communication system, which there were some things in the news a few weeks ago of L3 Harris just got a new contract for that. And they say, yeah, the electronic warfare system we have here based in New Mexico, the southern part of the state. And I'm just theorizing here that maybe that was in Alice Springs or Pine Gap, actually, at that time. I don't know. And this is the view of Pine Gap itself in Alice Springs, the NSA listening site. Okay, conclusions. The failures of 7 Russian satellites over 4 months was very unusual. I can't specifically prove that they are under attack, but that's suspicious. The GLONASS attacks, well, it was not a natural phenomena. It began exactly at 6:30 in the morning, Pine Gap time. And, I've been to these places. These guys come in at 6 a.m., get their coffee. At 6:15, they start exercising the attack. And at 6:30, they start it. They push the red button or whatever. And the other funny thing, too, is the attack was sequenced. If there were several GLONASS satellites in view at the same time, they would be ticked off GLONASS 1, 2, 3, 4 in numerical order. I mean, this is not a natural phenomena. It's too ordered and precise to have been that. And to me, that kind of proves that they came under attack, besides a few other factors. Wait a minute, I'm not finished here. The other ones are circumstantial. The Galileo attacks, maybe there's a warning to the Europeans. Now, this is why you have to think big in space, not tactically, not even strategically. It's got to be grand strategy and all. And it appears to me that, we're doing great in space. We got all these great cyber weapons and who knows what else. We're plinging at Russian satellites. The Russians get PO'd and they bring the war to the ground and they attack the American banking system and don't do anything about it. Seize, I think it was like 60 million bank accounts and sit there and do nothing about it. Now, suddenly the Obama administration at the time stopped criticizing Russia over the Ukrainian thing. You could see, suddenly there's no reports in the news and all that. And suddenly a peace treaty was signed, within a week after the attack on the American banking system. So I am summarizing that we won in space, the space war, but we lost on the ground, and ultimately we lost the space war. That it's more than just space. You've got to understand the whole picture, the diplomatic, economic, everything on this. And, there's so many examples in military history where a supposedly lesser foe beat a bigger foe, Maginot Line, very expensive, we're fighting the last war. And the same could happen in space if you don't think it through the bigger picture that, we look at these bright, shiny space systems we've got to defend in space, no one's going to get to us. Oh, yeah? Well, it's really human minds, and whoever's the most decisive, who understands space war the best, who understands the sequencing of attacks and the why and the vulnerabilities of your opponent, the fact that we probably will self-deter because we're not sure what's happening. We can't prove they did it to us. I have a whole book on satellite failures, and it's amazing how these satellite engineers believe in perfection. And they say, oh, we didn't know the sensor would point towards the bright moon and then start spinning out. Oh, we didn't know this, you know. And it takes them months to try to figure out, well, why did that satellite fail? I don't really know, but we think it's this. Now, if you've got a space war going on and things failing left and right, that's not going to cut it. You know, your SDA, space domain awareness and all that, you really got to know quickly. And you've got to have decisive leadership. And the trouble is that involves the politicians ultimately. I don't know if they're going to allocate that ability to start a space war to lower level military types. So something to think about. Okay, lessons learned. It was too obvious. Why should somebody like me on the street be able to detect it? You didn't have to have these attacks all coming from Australia. These cyber weapons aren't that big, not as big as you saw in that, you know, the CSS thing, that's jammer quality. They could be in embassies around the world. It could be on Navy ships floating around the world, and no one could figure it out that it was an intentional attack. Oh, these Russian GLONASS things just start blinking on. Who knows, you know? However, you can't be too subtle, because the whole point of the attack is not to deny the Russians the ability to use the GLONASS, is to send a message. So you got to make sure the message is really received, and they attacked a second time. Maybe the message wasn't received big enough, or the Russians didn't care. And then I've already said this, that we really have to understand the bigger picture. And this concept of, you know, what you're doing in space might have terrestrial consequences, but this concept of combined arms, that, well, you do space attacks and you do, you know, satellite attacks, or maybe you have this cyber weapon or jammer that isolates the satellite from ground controllers so we can't reconfigure it to defend itself. And you jam it for several hours, and you're waiting for a more effective ASAT to come into position and do the job right, you know, or combining special forces messing with ground terminals in adversary locations, maybe again with cyber or HPM means, things like that, at the same time that you've got an ASAT system coming up close and it's waiting from the signal from the SOF team that, yeah, we did it, or no, we didn't do it. Now the ASAT's going to go in because that's more politically unacceptable. So there's, you know, a lot of ways you have to combine all that. And the Space Force needs to, you know, have all these different people. They need to have the State Department part of them. I've been saying that for 25 years now, but they always cut that down, you know, because that ultimately some president is going to say, oh, you just spent $1 billion in this fancy new space weapon system. I really don't want to use it. You know, it's not diplomatically responsible. And if you had the diplomatic staff early on in its weapon development say, hey, if you change this slightly, it'll be slightly more acceptable when you really want to use it. Okay. Okay, that's it. There's a whole bunch of, if you get this briefing, you can click on my other briefings. I probably have 50 or 60 different briefings. That's just some of it. I do have a space warfare discussion group on LinkedIn, over 18,000 members, over 1,700 general officers and admirals, and 57 astronauts, a couple hundred people from the White House. Now, it's probably the most senior space warfare discussion group, and you could join that if you're interested in it. And if you've got any questions now, I'm open.
Yeah, thank you. This is really wonderful, wonderful talk, wonderful lecture. So, yeah, if you have any question in the audience, please click raise hand or type in the Q&A box. Well, while we're waiting for people to raise hand, I think the first question is, you mentioned about, in a few slides, you mentioned about the physics. You said some physics could be interesting. So could you kind of elaborate a little bit? What is the...
Well, this concept of closeness, I already said that it's not necessarily oh, he's 20 feet from me. It's that too, but they could be very close in terms of orbitology. There's other things like you've got Lagrangian points between the Earth and the Moon that is on top of the gravity well. And if you put an ASAT there, first of all, you'd be so far away from Earth sensors, they're not going to know you're there really, except they're putting together all these XGO sensor concepts now and all. But all you have to do is tip the into the gravity well, a little bit of a push, and it can come screaming down to geo, and no one's going to see that coming at you, and do some harm. Maybe that's more debris causing, or maybe as you fly by, you do something to it. So that's something to understand. And then I hear there's all kinds of crazy orbits when you're talking about near the moon and stuff like that. And then even during the 1960s, I think it was maybe the Apollo astronauts, they would, doing a rendezvous, and they would say, oh, well, okay, there's our target. Let me step on the gas and get closer to it. No, it don't work that way. You put more energy into your orbit, you go to a higher orbit. You don't get closer to the object. So some of those things are non-intuitive. And I bet you there's a whole bunch of others. There's a lot of crazy orbits. I think that's, again, part of this think tank thing, that you should start looking at crazy orbits. You can have, I've heard things like something goes out to the moon and flies back to the poles, and then has braking, and it's a sort of a geosynchronous orbit over the poles for a few months. And then the other crazy thing is if you've got electric thrusting. And there was a European satellite a few years ago that had electric thruster going for 2.5 years. It's escaped me the name now. If you had electric thrusters on critical satellite systems, and just before the war started, you started thrusting, suddenly you're not talking about Keplerian algorithms for your orbitals calculations. You're going to screw up all the orbital calculations, and suddenly all these satellites will be missing, and you won't know where they're coming from. And I've seen a certain arrogance coming from at least the old Space Command that, we know where all objects are. We know where they were launched and this and that. And I think, no, if somebody wants to be clever, they can be clever. And then you look at the satellite catalog and the analyst objects, those are objects that they don't know what they are. They're fully 1/3 of the satellite catalog. Fully 1/3 of the catalog, they don't know what the heck they are. So it's very easy to hide a satellite, a mean intent satellite. Go look at the patent office, 1970s patent for a low observable satellite, like a barbell. There's all kinds of things that you can do to really hide satellites. Next question.
Victor, go ahead, Mr. Cook.
Yeah, so that's related to what you were talking about. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so what generally, I put LEO or MEO, but what's the optimal orbit that they usually would position space assets, military type assets out? What's the optimal operating orbit?
Well, you got low Earth orbit for the imagery. You want to get as close as possible. You have sun synchronous, which is low Earth orbit for the imagery, because you want to do shadow control. You want to be over the same place on Earth around 10:30 in the morning. You want a little bit of shadows to show contrast. That's where the weather satellites like to be. You've got the medium Earth orbit, where you've got, am I getting echo here? No. The GPS satellites, medium Earth orbit. And then classically, you've got the big, heavy communication satellites, the geosynchronous. Of course, that's being blown out of the water with all these what is it, 500, 600 kilometers, 10,000, 20,000 satellites, you know, SpaceX and all are putting up. So those are generally the ones you're interested in, but there's a very interesting new interest in the moon, probably because China is, I think China's going to go over there and abrogate the Outer Space Treaty and say they own the moon myself. But there is just astounding interest, like Air Force Research Lab has all these new programs for space surveillance and lunar orbits called XGO and all that. So I think there's something happening up there. And in the next 10, 20 years, that's the new area to worry about.
So would they have to declare like airspace, space to operate in those areas? I mean, you know, some areas that have, in the atmosphere, you have airspace, clear military airspace, but they have to declare some military space.
You know, that's an interesting comment. I never heard of it. As far as I know, you can go anywhere you want, you know, in space, according to custom and UN treaties. No one can stop you. I don't think you can say, this is our area here. Anyone comes in this area, we're going to shoot you down or something like that.
So no, the interference would be caused if someone, say, put up a commercial satellite up against next to a military satellite. Is there a potential cause for conflict there? Having two objects, two pieces of equipment in the same orbit close together. I mean, you know. Well,
there's certain rules of the road, especially at geosynchronous, and people, I'd say, declare ownership of orbital slots, but they have to register it with the International Telecommunications Union or something like that.
Right.
That say, oh, in 5 years, I'm going to put a satellite in that orbital slot. Because they can't get too close to each other or they'll start interfering with each other and all. So in a sense, that's accepted ownership, I guess, over the lifetime of the satellite or whatever.
Okay. Yeah. Last question I want to know. So if they're in geosynchronous orbit, you know, they have different inclinations in geosynchronous orbit. Are they using different inclinations in geosynchronous orbit?
Dad.
Retro and
I'm
pro.
about to go live.
Is that all a combination?
To be on that.
I'm sorry, there's other people talking, and can you rephrase that again? I didn't get the whole question.
Okay, yeah, I'm getting the same feedback somehow. Yeah, I want to know, so if, say, in orbit, they have different inclinations they use. Are they also prograde and retrograde in combination? They use the combination retrograde, prograde type orbits, different inclinations? And
well, certainly, like Israel uses retrograde because they don't want to launch a missile east with all their enemies.
okay.
I don't know if too many other people use retrograde. And certainly there's geosynchronous inclined. Maybe I think some of them are 10 degrees. And somehow they get a little bit of better coverage. And it's kind of a circle 8 Lissajous pattern on the ground on that. But there's certainly things you can play with. Russia, I don't know if they're that big on the geosynchronous because they're such a northern country. They do highly inclined Molniya kind of orbits, they're called. They go way up in space and then come down slowly, you know, and they have multiple satellites and all that. Though that ends up being much more difficult for us to track if they're highly eccentric, meaning it's a squished circle. Or highly inclined makes them more difficult to track.
Hello, perfect. Okay. All right, thanks.
Sure. No questions? Or you just can't talk?
No, Rich is coming. Mr. Lehman, go ahead. Please unmute yourself. Rich, go ahead. Rich, you can click unmute and then you can.
There he is.
There. I think I hit the right button there. Is it working?
Yes, it is. I know it's hard to figure it out. I have trouble all the time.
Paul, that was really an excellent presentation. Thank you very much. I'm wondering if in some of your analyses, for example, the Crimean War that you used, the Russian winning the space war was a terrestrial event. And I'm wondering if having a concentration in Space Command might be one level below what we should start thinking. Since space seems to be mostly info, maybe some of the strategies ought to look at the whole cyber and the whole information kind of warfare. I'm sure you've probably thought about that, and I just kind of wondered what your views are.
Well, getting back to, defining whether you won or not, the whole point of the space attacks were to influence the Russians to stop doing what they're doing in Ukraine. And that didn't work out. And we maybe in the back of our mind said, well, if they don't get serious in Ukraine over these GLONASS attacks, we're going to, ratchet it up to more and more severe things. And the Russians said, oh, yeah, we had enough of this. We're going to do what we're good at, I'm told. They're very good at the cyber. And we're going to attack you another way because we want to make you stop. So the whole purpose of the space attacks was to change Russia's mind, and that didn't work. And so you technically could say, oh yeah, technically that worked. But the whole point of war is not a pinball game and saying, I got this ball in the right hole or whatever, it's to influence other nations, ultimately, in one way or the other, to force them to your will or whatever. And in this case, it did not work. So I define that as a loss at the level that matters, the political, diplomatic level of relationships of countries. And that's the philosophy that, here we got this Space Force starting out, and we got to mold these, young minds are so interested in joining to think the right way and not think in terms of onesies and twosies, think of mass battles, think of integration with not only other US forces, Army and Navy, and what's happening on the battlefield, but integration with the political and integration with the international, especially with this being such a new area of conflict. And so much of it is culturally related because we're again dealing with human minds. It's adversary commanders fighting each other's minds. There's a cultural component, that we might say, we've got this great space weapon and we're going to attack this, country X satellite, and boy, are they going to hurt, And so we do it and we attack it and the satellite stops working. And the adversary says, why'd they attack that satellite? We weren't really using it. We don't care. I'm an old fogey here who doesn't really believe in space anyway. I'm doing the old-fashioned kind of war, Have you taken all that into account? And so you should have international partners who would have different perspectives on the different cultures. Part of this ground swell of understanding of the purpose, the doctrine, the functioning of the Space Force. How do we involve our allies, if at all? I mean, yeah, we're sort of involving them, but who knows in reality? And I'm sorry, did I answer the question?
Well, yeah, sort of. I guess what I was poking at is there an organizational link between cyber command and space command as far as space command strategy vis-a-vis cyber and vice versa? In other words, would the space command have conceived of the bank attack?
Right, or being able to do something about it. And then how do you conceive that when there's 10 million other different kinds of attacks that can happen?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, we're going to go against the water or electricity or whatever, Yep. So I don't have links into Space Force or Cyber Command or anything like that. I'm retired now. I've been retired 9 years. So I'm kind of the academic level. So I'm not sure what they're doing. I do know though, Air Force cyber forces participate in space warfare exercises. So they're at least testing things and understanding that. Now at a larger general to general officer level, that I don't know. Doctrine level, they must have their own doctrine things. I mean, I'm not sure who's running Doctrine right now at Space Force. I think they're just still all getting that together. No one's the last 30 years that I've dealt with Space Command and Air Force and all this stuff, no one was interested in space doctrine that I could tell. And I still can't tell if they're interested or not. So maybe it's hidden away somewhere. But I do know that cyber is the in thing for them. They think they can get away with a lot with cyber. And I guess in a sense you can. You're not breaking stuff. You have the plausible deniability. Oh, I didn't really do it. You know, it's sort of like, is it Stuxnet or something going against the Iranian nuclear centrifuges and all. And you can say, oh, no, we didn't do it. We don't know what it is. And, you know, and so you can do these subtly, you know, like we're constantly at war with all these subtle things. But to my mind, and maybe I'm just old fashioned, you have to excuse me, I'm 70 years old. I think of a thought experiment when it comes to cyber. And that is, here's this soldier in the trenches and these enemy tanks are starting to maneuver to attack him. And this egghead shows up in the trench and he shows the soldier this black box with a big red button. And he says, I assure you, I've been working on this for years and we spent millions of dollars on this. I assure you, if you push that button, that tank is going to stop. There's going to be a cyber attack, you know, on the tank systems and it'll stop. Unfortunately, you can either carry this black box with the red button or you can carry a bazooka. Now, which do you want to carry? And I'm old fashioned. I think it's more emotionally satisfying to see a smoking hole in the ground versus, oh yeah, I'm going to trust this egghead that if I push this button, that tank's going to stop. And then 30 seconds later, it's going to reboot and come squish me, you know? And it's the same with space. It's even worse in space. Oh, we attacked that satellite. The cyber code's in there. You know, it's going to deny it. Well, are you really sure? And the trouble with the US lately, well, for decades now, is we haven't had real adversaries. We had second and third rate countries who really didn't understand doctrine and, you know, and all, like this Navy captain I mentioned earlier on Schwarzkopf's staff. He says the Kuwaitis would come to him and say, well, look at these Marines, you know, out there off Kuwait City. When are they going to attack? And they would tell, oh, no, that's just a feint. We're going to sneak around them. And we assure you this is going to work, you know, and they're going to panic and all this stuff. And they never got it. The Kuwaiti generals never got it. This just sneaking around the back and you know, panic. I don't know, you know, the whole concept of infowar and things like that. And so we're used to, well, think of the Air Force. When is the last time the air war was in doubt? That we really weren't sure if we're going to win in the air. Gee, early days of World War II, not even late World War II. No one alive today in a position of responsibility has ever had a really tough time, you know, fighting an air war, I think. I don't know, maybe I'm being arrogant here. And so has that made us lazy? And, oh yeah, we understand that. We know where all satellites are at and what their functions are. Oh, they'll never do that. And I've been to 15 different space exercises. And I had one where they, of course, were fighting the last war. They were, what was it? The Chinese ASAT test or something like that. And they said, oh, they're going to shoot this ASAT. And I said, why don't we put 2 ASATs on the same booster and one goes in and does the job, but maybe it doesn't. The other one holds back. And then, you know, does another attack. The first one didn't hit it. And if not, it hides out in the debris field until the orbit's over Antarctica, and then it floats off and does something else. And the colonel says, "Oh, you can't do that." I said, "Well, why not? You know, I'm just being a little bit clever, not terribly clever." And so all these exercises, they don't have a clever adversary, you know, if you really think about it. And if you've got, you know, several billion Chinese and a whole bunch of them are about to die, people get very clever when you're about to die. And we're going to find something, people, more capable adversaries, I think, in the next few years.
Yeah, well, thanks, Paul. I'm gonna yield for others here, but very thought-provoking talk, and I'm gonna look forward to pulling up some of the others. I'm assuming that is this presentation going to be available online?
I think so, and there'll also be I'll be giving more presentations over the next year or so.
Okay,
Oh, and there's
great.
in the newsletter. In the newsletter, there's printed. I think there's one going out that I have the top 40 rules of how to win space wars.
Sign me up.
Yes, the recording will be posted after the event, and we'll send the email to everyone, the attendees, and we'll post the information there as well. So while we're waiting for more people to ask questions, I do have one. The recent Chinese hypersonic missile test. Could you kind of comment on this? What is the challenge for the space war and the implication for that, and how are we going to detect and handle it?
Well, that's like the old Russian FOB system, fractional orbital bombardment system, where they get around the UN restriction of weapons of mass destruction in space by saying, "Oh, it's not in full orbit." Now, I'd like to find out more about it. I haven't seen what orbit or what path did it really take. And I think the FOB system from the Russians, the whole point was to get beyond our distant early warning, the dew line of the northern reaches in Alaska and all that, to be able to come from the south. So, but that's all nuclear. As far as for space, if that has the space capability, you know, to kind of boost up there and then go higher, if it has extra fuel and all that, I mean, that, well, that's sort of like the old F-15 ASAT, air-launched. You can go in any azimuth. You can go anywhere. This thing can be based anywhere around the world. And so are you going to see it coming? Probably not. I mean, we have the best space surveillance network in the world, and we miss things all the time. I don't know how these other countries, you know, China and Russia and all, how do they really understand what's happening in space? And I think that kind of makes it unstable because you're really not sure what's happening one way or the other. And so I sometimes wonder if like the UN should put a network of optical sensors. They don't cost that much. There's, you know, companies doing it, put them a network around the world to be able to be, I'm not sure I'd call them an honest broker, but to understand what other people are doing in space and all the funny business going on. And that might be, you know, decreasing, destabilizing effects. I even thought, gee, the Vatican should put these around churches around the world with good weather or something. And to be able, you know, they have a Vatican observatory to be able to, again, figure out, gee, is a space war start to happen? Why is this guy coming really close to this other one? Why is this satellite suddenly stop working? You know, because all the countries are keeping this under wraps, what they're doing. And they are doing things. I mean, why do we have all this seriousness and billions of dollars more in the space budget and things like that? I mean, space war has been happening, is happening now, and will get worse.
And you also mentioned about this, the Navy, also the different organizations, the military, and then recently their news talking about Army also started their Space Command and the Coast Guard. So it looks like many different branches of military has their own individual space command.
Oh,
So
really? I hadn't heard the Coast Guard.
yeah, I can forward you the link. Some of our members forward that to me.
Oh, okay.
Coasties, they also have their space command. So you mentioned about the battlefield management. So with those diverse space command and different players, who and how someone was going to coordinate all these for the battlefield management?
Yeah, who knows if they're all coming together because they just want a piece of the funding pie. You're right. I mean, isn't it the JCS, the Joint Chiefs, that are supposed to kind of coordinate this? I'm not enough into the politics and all to understand that, but that's certainly a good question for people to understand how this is all working out. And, you know, all this is backdoor kind of stuff, and Congress is involved, and that's why they didn't let the Space Force be separate from the Air Force, at least at first. You know, it's all these subtleties of organizational relationships that, you know, I don't understand. You need a PhD in that.
Yeah, and also, you know, you mentioned the subtlety. I think that's a very great point. So you don't actually have to shoot and make a lot of space debris. And of course, the space debris is another big issue. If you know, somebody shoot down the satellite, it generates lots of the space debris. Who is going to clean up the battlefield afterwards?
Right.
That's a very interesting point. And,
yeah, I don't really understand. Like, some commercial firms are putting space debris cleanup systems and countries and all, like, who's paying for that? Since it's not their debris. I mean, theoretically, according to the UN again, and the treaties that were signed, you're responsible for whatever effects whatever you launched into space has, whether it's falling on the ground and smashing through a house, or I suppose debris hurting somebody else's satellite. So I think there's some legal regime for that. And maybe that's the reason why a commercial firm is going to do cleaning. I don't even know how you do that. I mean, it sounds so expensive to do all that. And then I think a lot of it, you know, you look at the Hollywood movies of space debris and all that coming and hitting your manned system and all that. And it just, I haven't really done any analyses, but it just seems to me if all this debris is in the same orbit as you are, then it's not hitting you. It's flying in the same speed and things like that. It's only if it's coming in eccentric, inclined, or something like that. But it's not, I think, what you see in Hollywood. And yes, it has happened, and it will be happening. We shouldn't have debris as best we can. But you know, especially the animations where you see, oh my gosh, look at all this debris and satellite bodies and all this stuff. But the sizes of those dots are probably the size of cities. You know, there's actual debris. If it was two size, you wouldn't even be able to see it. You know, I mean, think about a lot of satellites are, or at least they're starting to, are the size of a basketball, you know, microsatellite and stuff like that. And if you told somebody, well, take this basketball and dribble it somewhere on Earth and lose it, and then I have to find it. You know, by the way, it's our squared problem where you're talking about tens of thousands of kilometers larger than the Earth. So it's just, oh my gosh, there's a heck of a lot of space up there. It's hard to conceive of it. And it's not like the pictures you show it, oh my gosh, it's all this junk floating around and all that. And it's an issue, and you should do something about it. And I think there's general rules of safing the satellite so it doesn't explode afterwards, and trying to deorbit it or go into graveyard orbit. But, you know, there's funny business going on. I've developed software that looks at funny business in space. And it was like, gee, this Chinese satellite went into graveyard orbit, yet its orbital elements are getting better with time instead of worse from solar pressure and all. Are they faking out that it's a dead satellite? You know, and there's just a lot of funny things that are happening. And I'm particularly interested in debris. Things, you know, faking out that they're debris. I mean, there's you could send up a commercial, let's say civilian, civil satellite, and then again went over Antarctica or somewhere there's no sensors, South Pacific, maneuver out a satellite out of it from inside of it, and then blow up the satellite purposely. And they say, oops, our satellite, oh, I don't know what happened. It blew up. Look at all this debris. And then everyone forgets about it, where there's still that live satellite hiding in the debris. And, you know, what are you going to do about it? Can you really detect it? I was in Cheyenne Mountain Complex one time, been there several times, at the old SSC, before SMC was SSC, the Space Surveillance Center. And they told me a story about Mir, the Russian space station, where they have, you know, you flush the toilet a few times, and then after a while, they kick the honeypot out to burn up, I guess. And for a while, NORAD at the time tracked the honeypot as Mir instead of Mir itself, you know, 1,000 times different in size, until someone said, hey, the radar cross-section is wrong, you know. So if that's just accidental, what if someone's purposely trying to hide? You know, and what are you going to do about that? And debris is a perfect place to hide. Besides hiding inside old 1960s spent rocket boosters that already did half of the Holman transfer to GEO. I mean, there's so many things you can do. Why not a 0-degree inclined LEO low Earth orbit satellite? No sensors to detect it. It's not inclined. And all it has to do is increase its altitude. That's not too much delta V fuel. And it matches the orbit, attacks all kinds of LEO birds without anyone seeing it. It's at the equator. It never passes any radar sensor, though I think they're building one down there now. I mean, it doesn't take too much cleverness to fool people, especially people who think they know everything. You know, oh, well, look at all these sensors, and we know where everything's at. And no one would do that, you know, kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a wonderful point. I think Victor has a question. Victor, go ahead.
Yeah, not related to the text in the chat, but I was wondering, you mentioned shielding the public from military action. So, for instance, if you had space, we have space assets in space from all different countries, adversaries and allies, and what is followed, for instance, if you wanted to shield the general public from what the military is doing? For instance, they had to disable or dismantle or destroy one of the adversaries' spacecraft in space, one of their weapons in space. They did that. How would they proactively go about shielding that information or masking it to where the average citizen, and in case maybe some that maybe be able to track these objects, these space weapons in space, how would it go about shielding those actions from the general public that wouldn't arouse or cause general concern, or, you know, hey, this happened today in space, well, what are they doing, you know? And so how do they do that? I mean, how do they just do those actions and let nobody know about it, or how is it not detected, I should say?
Well, my example of the GLONASS attacks in the Ukrainian conflict, does anyone know about that? Is it any news thing picked up on that? What if you have a laser? Heck, I can go out and buy a 7.5 watt handheld laser. You had a laser that permanently damaged the focal plane of a satellite as it came over. Can anyone prove you did it? Does the person on the street know that? Can you plausibly deny, I didn't do that, I don't know what happened to it? Does the owner of the satellite even know what happened?
So there's no way to track the source of offensive weapon.
Well, I mean, you certainly, if you had laser detectors on it, you can see, oh, it came from this part of the country, you'd see a flash or something. Maybe you could say, well, my imagery sensor was pointed this way. I mean, you could throw a lot of that, but I think generally the attacked country and the country attacking like it being quiet, both of them, you know, surprisingly, because I think as a president of the United States, you have all sorts of crap coming across your desk every week. And some of it is space, very little would be space, but special forces going around doing things, CIA this and that. And all of us sitting here, fat, dumb, and happy, don't know about that.
Right.
And so that's kind of an established tradition, I think, in many senses. But as far as space, I mean, certainly cyber attack. And you can make the satellite spin out. You can make it maybe have its sensors point to the sun and burn it out. I don't know. You could make it its radiators not point to deep space, and it would overheat the satellite. I mean, you can do all this crazy stuff. I mean, I just came up with these on my own. I'm not saying that's what they're doing.
But,
and how would anyone on the ground even know that? How would even the satellite operator know that?
right. So there's no way, for instance, there's no way there's nothing that the general public or even the most advocate enthusiasts would have the equipment to detect any type of action like that. Look up there.
Well, now for years, there's been some group in Europe that loves tracking satellites. They're a bunch of astronomers. The big way of tracking is not necessarily radar, is optical. The radar doesn't have that much distance. And for years, they've been, trying to find NRO satellites and, all these secret satellites and things like that. And so they're kind of trying, and they have these commercial networks of optical sensors around the world that, certainly are tracking a lot of things. I would assume they have some sort of agreement with the US government that they're not going to track certain things. I mean, one of the times I was in Norwich Shodden Mountain, again, at the SSC Surveillance Center, they had yellow stickies that saying, do not track this object. Do not track this one. Sensitive object. We provide the UN catalog of space objects. I'm sure there's a bunch of NRO birds up there that are not in the catalog, and things we're doing. Who's tracking? The biggest threat now, at least in the peacetime level, is the inspector satellites. China has them, Russia has them. They'll probably say we have them. And you see things in the news, oh, this thing came too close and all. I mean, they're playing this cat and mouse game all the time up there. And why? Maybe they have a little pea shooter and they shoot at something, or they attach a space mine or semi-high powered laser, zapping this, or, and how can we even know that's happening and who's tracking them? And, I said, I'm a member of it's called Space Track, that you can join up and you get all the orbital elements. And for years, I used to download the radar cross section, kind of the size of the objects. And 4 or 5 years ago, suddenly, instead of publishing the absolute RCS, that they had measured at the time, they started publishing the average. And I assume that meant because inspector satellites were up there. I know, I've been on 5 programs, inspector satellites. The RCS would change every time inspector satellite came to another satellite, it would double or whatever. And you could track where they're going from satellite to satellite. So I assume they stopped publishing it because of that. So they're trying to hide, and that's good. And maybe it's good that the general populace doesn't know this, because even if they did know it, they're not technically savvy enough to understand what's really going on. And even politically savvy enough, and so ignorance is bliss, I think, to a certain degree. In the same way, I get back to, well, we don't understand what the CIA is doing all the time, and that's fine with me. I'm sure there's a lot of bad things happening.
It's okay. Jerry has another question. It's okay, Jerry. Go ahead to ask you.
Hi. So, really interesting presentation. I have 2 questions. First, how far ahead of our adversaries do you think the United States is right now in terms of strategy and technology? And my second question would be, since companies like SpaceX are showing up in the news more and more, how do you think the advent of private space exploration will affect space warfare and diplomacy?
You're taxing an old man here, the two questions. What was the first question again? One question at a time.
How far ahead of our adversaries do you think the
Okay.
United States is right now in terms of strategy and technology?
You know, there have been space weapons for 50 or 60 years. You know, I just listed a few of those, the direct descent ASAT and all that. These guys haven't been, you know, twiddling their thumbs for a while, well, for a long time. So, I'm sure we got all kinds of brilliant technology. But the brilliance is, how do you use it? When, if, why? So I'm sure we had brilliant technology with the GLONASS thing, yet we still lost, I guess, you know, because of doctrine. So I think doctrine's everything. And I've been studying military history past 55 years. I got like 800 books on military history. And you look at World War II, I was born right after it, so that's what I studied a lot. You have, you know, that the Allies in World War II, the British and French, had 17 times more tanks than the Germans. The Allied tanks had better, thicker armor and better guns on them than the Germans. Heinz Guderian, who you know, did all the Blitzkrieg thing, didn't even sit in a tank until I think 3 years before the Blitzkrieg, you know, happened. Why did they win? Why did they have the biggest defeat of the 20th century? You know, with France, I mean, France lost 100,000 soldiers in that. Why? Because the French used tanks like they did in World War I as infantry support. Why? Because they believed in the Maginot Line, who, by the way, was built by German firms, for what that's worth. The Germans had superior doctrine. Why did they have superior doctrine? Because they lost in World War I. You learn more from losing than from winning. We've been winning too many wars. So what have we learned? Especially with entirely different adversaries who are bigger and stronger in different cultures, different ways of thinking of things. And we sit here and say, oh, no, space junk, or, oh, we better not do that. We better not do that. And they're thinking, kill them all. And so they don't mind creating space junk, I presume. They don't mind world opinion. Does that make us vulnerable? So you say technologically and doctrine. I would think in some sense, all countries are weak in doctrine because who knows how it's going to play out. I got a lot of ideas, but I don't know, you know, but you better start thinking about it. And, you know, the old adage is the first casualty of war, the plans, you throw out the plans. So it's not the plans, it's the planning that counts, that trains you to think certain ways. And I think that's one of the biggest things that the Space Force should be doing, besides getting the organization right. You know, well, how do we use the, you know, the Navy and the Army and all these other things? How do we use the allies? But how do we use them? You know, how do we use, oh, we've got all these great systems. I'm sure we're spending billions of dollars on them. How do you really use them? At what points politically, or what point of escalation on the ground? Can you have a different escalation ladder in space versus the ground? How do we support our allies? What do we really do if, okay, someone takes out our satellite? Do we really understand what they did? Do we understand their intent? There's so many wars that have been caused by misunderstanding of intent. You know, oh, they were just show of force, and we interpret it as life and death, and we started a war. You know, so the balance of ability, knowledge, and intelligent action, you know, and if you got to have all three of those, or you lose, you know, I think. And I think it's very easy to lose in space. I think some clever adversary that doesn't care about political correctness, that is lucky enough to have the right general officer who understands space, and lucky enough not to have minimal interference from the politicians above them, like we'll probably have, is probably going to be the winner. And surprise is everything. I think any country can develop space weapons. Any country has clever young kids who love cyber attacks. And so you could always do cyber. You always have universities with lasers, and you got to have accurate tracking and all that for at least blinding or maybe damaging. You know, the high-powered lasers, I don't know about ultimately the military effectiveness, but it's just very clever people with a political, cultural, social system different than us are going to have different ways of thinking and different ways of attacking. And who knows which way will be the best, but we should really start thinking about it now. And I think we're spending money in all these space systems before we even got the doctrine down right. Maybe we're wasting money on systems that won't actually be usable. And by usable, it means, well, what level of conflict? Some will be usable, like the inspector satellites, usable at lower levels, but not at full level conflict. You know, they're not responsive enough. The different kinds of adversaries in different geographic regions might be different. You know, I heard things like the North Korea, the Korean conflict. And well, you know, imagery satellites actually wouldn't be too effective because there's so many mountain passes, and we know they're going to come through the mountain passes, and whether we have a picture or not didn't matter. Now, I don't know if that's really true, but you know, that's different than the open deserts in the Middle East, or you know, Straits of Taiwan, or something. You know, that's maybe different flavors of space capabilities. And then I think one of the most important things, well, first of all, 3 or 4 most important things is SSA, SDA, understanding not only the adversary, but yourself, maneuverability, having plenty of fuel to confuse, get around. And as part of maneuverability is the pre-conflict placement. Should you concentrate your ASATs over the Pacific or over Europe? You know, India, I don't know. Or maybe your different flavors. Lasers will work better in Europe versus, you know, Taiwan, or so we should have a different flavor. You know, by the way, we should have, you know, again, this combined arms thing, 2 or 3 different phenomenologies of anti-satellites, maybe going against the same target, just to really be sure of it and increase the probability to kill and stuff like that. Yeah, let's see. What was the second question?
Yeah, that made a lot of sense. The second question was, since we keep hearing about companies like SpaceX in the news more and more, how do you think the advent of private space exploration will affect space warfare and diplomacy?
Yeah, I don't know. First of all, there's been a lot of talk of putting military capabilities on commercial satellites. Now, you know, I understand that World War II, we had commercial ships shipping arms. You know, by the way, getting sunk by subs. Putting commercial thing, I think of the drones, the UAS systems that we used in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they some of them used commercial satellite systems to transmit control of the drones back to Creech Air Force Base. Is it in Nevada, where the guys were, you know, maneuvering them and blowing things up and all that. So it appears to me that commercial satellite system is part of the kill chain. And I'm no lawyer, but it just sounds to me they're a legal target. You know, and so if you're using Intelsat, which is owned by a whole bunch of countries, you're using one channel and you're transmitting this kill chain information, does that make Intelsat a target? Does that make a ground control in France a legal target to be blown up because of it? You know, And so this mixing and matching, and I've been at some of these exercises where they invite the commercial operators in, and the commercial people say, "Oh yeah, the Air Force is going to protect our satellite system," and I scratch my head and say, "I don't know how to even protect Air Force satellite systems. You're talking about hypervelocities in space. You're not going to have a 20-foot thick concrete wall defending you. You can't defend, really. That's part of the instability, maybe. That offense is everything, I think. I mean, they think, oh, I'll maneuver out of the way. Well, the guy's coming in fast. If he has sensors and see a maneuver, he just makes a slight course correction and keeps coming in. I don't know how you defend those commercial satellites. So, do you have to reimburse them for $100 million, And then they talk about, we use the SpaceX system with tens of thousands of communication satellites. And that means you'd have to have tens of thousands of ASATs to take it out, I think, they're all communicating to each other. And it just seems like one cyber virus in one goes to all of them, One thing I've learned with the cyber is people are so damn clever. It's just, they'll always find a way. There's no way to absolutely defend. And so, okay, we've got SpaceX up there, and I don't know, they're going to put a space station, maybe. I guess they're going to have their launch thing with 100 people on it going to the moon. Are they expected to be defended against? Let's say they go to the moon. I mean, ridiculously, they say, 5 years from now or something like that. And they land on the moon and start a base. And China has a base on the far side of the moon. Would they start fighting? Do we start fighting out there? China says, I could conceivably see China launching an astronaut to the moon in the next few years. And 10 minutes before boots on the ground on the moon, they abrogate the Art of Space Treaty that says you can't own celestial bodies. And they say, no, we now own it. And SpaceX has a colony, or tries to put a colony there. Do we have to defend it? We got Space Marines now, so that complicates things. I guess that's all I'm saying. Some people think it's a panacea to have more targets, I guess. And that's true to a certain sense, for survivability, resilience, and all that. But you're complicating things. And that's beyond, that's a political, social thing of, would you be able to tolerate 100 people in a SpaceX spaceship getting killed on the way to the moon because some bad actor did it? And would you do something on the ground about it? That'd make an interesting novel, I guess. So I guess I can't really answer the question. It's mysterious.
Great. Mr. Szymanski, do you have time for another question from Victor? I think he has another question, or you have to go?
No, that's fine.
Okay, Victor, go ahead.
Oh yeah, mine was just related to, a lot of most everything you bases on satellites and orbiting mission systems. But what if has it been explored that there's a possibility of actually stationing? Like you have a space station out there right now. Is there been any talk around, anything been kicked around as to establishing a military space station, where they can actually commence, or they can perform military operations in
The time
space?
is 2:00 p.m.
Yeah, I mean, the original space station was supposed to be military. There's, forget the name, MOL, M-O-L, Manned Orbital Lab from the 60s. And that was the program. It wasn't the ISS and things like that. The Mir, the Russian space station, I guess they claimed it was civilian, but you look at the inside and it has a huge camera pointed towards the Earth. It had this, anti-aircraft cannon on it and all. So, good luck on it being civilian. I remember years ago them asking the military, oh, do you want a base on the moon? You know, that sounds like a cool thing. We've seen it in Hollywood movies. And they say, oh, gee, I don't know, you know, that's awfully far away and we can't really figure a good reason why we really wanted to be there. But maybe that's changed now, that maybe the moon's becoming like the Western Hemisphere. And, you know, even if China declares they own the whole moon, it's like, well, yeah, Spain declared the whole, you know, they own the whole Western Hemisphere, but good luck on defending it and stuff like that. So I don't know, maybe that's, I doubt they're going to put in a manned military station, because that takes so long and so much funding. And then you get to the point of, again, why? What exactly is the purpose?
Right.
Yeah, I think Victor initially intended to add something like Star Trek, military operation from space, like Star Trek.
But yeah, that was part of it. You know, this is conceptualization, but stuff like that, eventually, it seems like to me it would lead to based operations in space, where you'd actually have a ship out there monitoring, controlling it, you know, for so many lengths of time, orbiting the space, orbiting Earth, just to monitor and measure, you know, activities on the ground in space up from a ship.
Yeah, it'd be an awfully juicy target, I tell you, even for a nuke or something. I'm sure sooner or later. I mean, you see the Star Wars things and this fight, you know, TIE fighters and all. It just seems to me the G-forces on a manned system would just kill you, flatten you, you know, explode you. And it wouldn't be a very effective fighter with the guy on it. Especially, you know, he doesn't really understand the orbital dynamics inside his primitive part of his brain. And all the calculations would have to be so fast. The maneuvering would have to be so fast. I mean, what is he really doing? Now, of course, we'd still have manned if you're going to go board somebody else's space station, I guess, and, you know, Space Marines. I mean, I'm sure I am wrong on that, but I think I'm at least half right that technologically, I mean, it's the same thing as unmanned aircraft.
But you operate zero G though. You're operating in zero G out there. So,
yeah, but not you still have the centripetal forces and the maneuvering forces. You know, if you suddenly have to, yeah, I mean, the thrusting forces, and you don't want to be in a predictable orbit because the guy will know where you're going, and so you're going to probably be thrusting around. I mean, even in aircraft, it's positioning's everything.
Right.
So you want to rapidly position on this side and that side, and you know, I would think, and maneuverability would be the key, especially if some missiles coming at you. If you could maneuver faster than that missile, even things like, oh, lasers hitting me. Well, I'm going to start spinning now to distribute the power across me, you know, but the guy inside just got flattened. I don't know. I mean, it'd be interesting to analyze all this. And I have a book coming out next year. In one of the chapters, I have an author who talked about space settlements, and it's fascinating, all the aspects of it. And you're almost talking about that and how you would maybe settle above the planet first and these kinds of things you're talking about, and then colonize the planets. But there were so many military questions, and that's what he got into, of the different aspects of it. So it's certainly a fascinating field. But think about, what is it, the X-30 or that little mini space plane that's been going up? It's not manned, and it's been going up for over a year, and it's gone up 3 or 4 times or something like that. And it's doing all kinds of, I'm sure, very interesting things, but no one felt a big need to have it manned. And as far as I know, there's no manned military programs at the moment, but it doesn't mean 50 years from now, there might be something else.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, that might disappoint you.
That's war. That's
yeah.
Maybe 100 years.
Yeah, that's interesting because this also brought the interesting point. If China launch attack from the moon and, on the satellite or something, that's another kind of, aspect related to Victor's question.
Well, they're certainly worried about the moon, the military, and they weren't worried about it just a few years ago. No one cared about it over my entire career, except just recently. And they're not going to get funding and do all this if there wasn't a really good reason. And I'm sure that reason is related to China in one way or the other, because no one else is messing with the moon that I know of. Well, India, I guess, sent something in there, but.
Yeah, they brought a very good point about earlier that if China attacked Taiwan during a geomagnetic storm, and you won't really know whether it's from the solar wind or something, or it's actually attack from China. It's very hard to tell.
Right.
Very good point. Yeah, very good point.
Yeah.
And the case you mentioned about the World War II, that's marginal line. That's also very good point. The strategy.
Yeah, you had to worry about arrogance, that overconfidence, that we know everything and we just spend 10 times what you spend on space, and so thus we will win. And there's just over thousands of years of military history. That's the surest way to lose.
Yeah, that's the Heinz Guderian, right? That's the general
Right.
Guderian. Yeah. He got fired at the end of World War II.
Yeah, that was probably more politics, but I think it was more that the German generals knew the war was over with, but Hitler didn't want to stop.
Yeah, this is very interesting, very exciting. So,
and of course, he might have been a better general for blitzkrieg versus set point battles. I mean, there's different kinds, different flavors of generals, and there'll be different flavors of generals for space. Somebody who's good at working with the moon versus working at Leo, maybe.
This is amazing point. I think I heard some story, he was kind of partially successful in fending off, a battle by the Russian at that time. Zhukov was very upset because they thought they were going to have a landslide victory, but Guderian was able to hold them off for a battle or something like that.
Yeah.
But you are right, he probably good at blitzkrieg, but not good for those kinds of battles. Okay, so yeah, actually, I'm speaking. I have tons more questions, so but I don't see more questions from the audience. But so I think what happened is next is we will kind of call the end of the event today. But if you would like to stay a little bit longer, and if some audience would like to stay to chat a little bit, that's welcome. But otherwise, we don't want to keep you for too long. But if you want to stay and chat with some people who are going to stay here, that's wonderful.
Okay.
Yeah, so anybody have any question? Otherwise, we'll conclude the event today. But you are welcome to stay a little bit to chat among the audience, or if the speaker has some more time to stay, asking more questions. So thank you so much, and this is a wonderful presentation. There's just so many exciting things. I personally have tons of questions. I can keep pouring, but yeah. So, but good thing keep coming. A speaker will come back again, and we'll have this article as well, and we'll post this information also after the event, so you're welcome to look more into it. So thank you very much. So yeah, have a good weekend. Thank you very much. And again, you're welcome to stay to network a little bit. And so otherwise, we'll stop the recording now. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for your time then.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a wonderful, amazing presentation. Thank you so much.